Good evening, everyone. My name is Gary O'Neill. Apologies, some of you who are watching this, if we haven't met before or if we haven't spoken. Either that means you're zooming in from a great distance, or because of COVID, you've not been able to be in the cathedral yet, but hopefully we're going to put that right at some point in the future. We're thinking this Lent about God's story and our story. And obviously at the cathedral, I'm responsible for worship and liturgy. So I'm particularly interested in the ways in which we explore God's story through liturgy and worship. Now, in 10 minutes, there are not many things that we can cover in great depth. So I'm going to try and keep it fairly simple and keep it to just two issues, which hopefully will emerge quite simply. The two issues are this, just in case you miss them later, the difference between hierarchy and the difference between inclusion. I'm sure all of us are familiar at some level with the Book of Common Prayer, and let's just stick with the Book of Common Prayer that's in 1662 without confusing the matter. One thing I can say about the Book of Common Prayer in 1662 is that it was revolutionary. It completely changed the face of Anglican liturgy at the time. Why did it do this? Because of three important things. First of all, it was in English. In other words, it was not in Latin. Secondly, it was audible. If you have a moment to flick through the Book of Common Prayer anytime when you've got a few spare minutes, you'll find frequent references where it says the priest shall say audibly. What does that mean? That means because before, in many monasteries and religious communities, the worship took place behind a screen. In other words, at a great distance from the people. It may well have been prayed in Latin, and because of the screen, people wouldn't be able to see very much. It's one of the reasons why bells were invented, but we're not going to explore bells tonight. So the Book of Common Prayer, 1662, a great revolution. But the 1662 prayer book and its liturgy was still extremely hierarchical. What do I mean by that? Think of any Church of England building that you've been in that's more than 50 or 60 years old. Most of them have a familiar shape. You come in at the back, you walk down the middle. At some point, the pews come to an end and you come to the chancel step. Then you come to the choir. Then you come to another step. Then you might come to a communion rail. Then you might come to 2 or 3 steps. That is, of course, if you are allowed in the sanctuary beyond the communion rail, and you will come to an altar or a table, and the table will be fixed against the wall. And the priest, when he, because in 50, 60 years ago would always be he, when the priest stands in front of the altar, he and the whole congregation are looking east. And the whole of the worship and the whole of the building is designed to take your thoughts and your mind's eye down the building, up the steps, towards the altar, and then perhaps to a reredos behind the altar, perhaps to some big 6 candles, and then going even further up, perhaps a glorious east window. It's all designed to take your prayers and your thoughts in that direction. However, not only is the prayer book hierarchical in the sense that only the priest is allowed to say something. If you're a recent experiencer of Book of Common Prayer, that may be something that you don't realize. If a Book of Common Prayer is done, as it were, following the rubrics exactly, then only the priest ever speaks. I'm exaggerating a little bit. There's the odd little response, but basically it's almost a monologue from beginning to end. And secondly, everything is set. There is to be no variation. The words are virtually the same from Sunday to Sunday, including the prayers. Now, when we get to 1980, all of a sudden things begin to change. There was throughout the world in the 1950s and the 1960s and 1970s an enormous amount of ecumenical liturgical activity. In other words, sisters and brothers from different denominations throughout the world were all thinking about liturgy and worship together. And from that emerged, among many, many things, one primary change, one primary consideration, that the definition of worship or the definition of liturgy, it is the work of the people. And everything from 1980 flows from that in the Church of England, including all the things that we do in common worship. Some new words came into our vocabulary. Perhaps the most controversial at the time was the word president. Unfortunately for us in England, with our kings and queens, we have a rather negative idea, perhaps, of what presidents might look like in different parts of the world. But different denominations use similar words. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, uses the word presider, which is a word that describes what the president does, because the president is the person who presides over the worship. And most importantly, certainly for me anyway, the idea emerged that the worship is celebrated by the people of God. The worship is celebrated by the people of God. Now, before that, and sadly to my mind, even to this day, many clergy in particular talk about either saying Mass or talking about celebrating on a Sunday. But in actual fact, it's quite clear for Anglicans in the Church of England, ever since 1980, that there's only one group of people who celebrate, and the people who celebrate are the people of God. One person, a man or a woman, as a priest, has a privilege and responsibility of presiding over that worship, because the worship is now corporate. Many, many things flow from this. Very obvious ones are things like taking the altar or table off the wall in order for the priest to stand behind it. And in many churches, of course, the building is exactly the same as it was when the church was built. But over the last 50 years, many older churches have been reordered in order to get the feeling that the people of God are gathering around the table rather than the people of God gathering in front of the table. If you can think of iconic cathedrals like the Liverpool Cathedral, in the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool, for example, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that idea, that design, that we're gathering around the people of God. In Blackburn Cathedral, for example, even though it's an old building which has been there for several centuries and gone through different iterations, as it were, one of the big changes that was initiated through the 1960s and the 1970s was the implementation of that nave altar or table and that marvelous corona, which gives the effect, when the building is full, say with 1,200 people, of everyone gathering around the table rather than gathering in front of the table. So it is, I would suggest, a fundamental sea change that happened only 50 years ago, and yet many of us have still not taken this sea change in our bones. There are many examples I could give of the way in which even our modern liturgies are still littered with throwbacks to the past, whereby the worship was hierarchical and we were still really assuming that it was the priest who was celebrating. So I leave you with two questions. In thinking of your own experience, whether it's at the cathedral or wherever you worship, in what ways do you still experience worship which is hierarchical? That's the first question. And my second question is this: how can we make our worship feel more like that it is inclusive and that it is the whole people of God who are involved in that worship and not just a few special people? So two questions. In what ways have you experienced worship as being inclusive? And secondly, in what ways, wherever we worship, could we change our worship to make it feel more inclusive, make it feel more like a celebration of the whole people of God and not just one person? Thank you for listening.